It was meant to be a peaceful weekend, just four friends escaping the chaos of city life. Ria, Samir, Vikram, and Arjun had been planning the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: find a quiet cabin in the hills, bring some food, games, and drinks, and spend 2 days surrounded by nature. After scrolling through dozens of options online, they found the perfect place: an old wooden cabin tucked deep in the forest, far from any town or highway. The pictures showed a small porch, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out into nothing but trees. It looked peaceful, untouched, and strangely inviting. They arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sky turned orange and the forest began to darken. The cabin stood silently among tall pine trees, its wood darkened with age, and its windows reflecting the thick shadows of the forest. Birds had gone quiet, and a chilly breeze swept through the trees, rustling leaves like whispers. Still, the group was excited. It was exactly what they wanted. No traffic, no neighbors, no loud noise. Just nature, silence, and each other. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. There were 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace in the center of the living room. The floorboards creaked a little under their feet, and the whole place had a faint smell of old wood and something else, something dusty, like forgotten memories. The walls were decorated with old paintings of trees and deer, and in one corner stood a tall grandfather clock, its hands stuck at midnight. After settling in, they lit the fireplace and cooked a small dinner. As the fire crackled, the 4 friends laughed and shared stories. The flames threw shadows on the walls, dancing like quiet ghosts, but no one noticed. The cabin felt warm, and the night was still. Outside, the forest stood dark and still, holding its breath. By midnight, they were playing cards, sipping drinks, and talking about everything from their childhood to their fears. The mood was light, cheerful even. If anyone felt a strange chill, or noticed how the wind had suddenly stopped, they didn't say it out loud. It was just the first night, after all. Nothing had gone wrong. Not yet. But something had started. Something unseen had already begun to watch. The trees outside the window weren't just trees anymore. And as the last laugh of the night echoed through the room and the fire died down to soft red embers, something shifted in the silence. The cabin, once calm, now seemed to breathe slowly, like it had finally woken up. And the forest? The forest was listening. The following morning, the air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing down on the cabin. The sun barely reached the forest floor, casting long shadows between the trees. It was an eerie quiet, the kind that makes you pause, like everything in nature was holding its breath. Arjun stepped outside first, the cool air hitting his face as he stretched. A glance at the trees told him something was off. No birds, no breeze. Even the ground beneath his feet felt unnervingly still. As he walked to the edge of the porch, something caught his attention. A faint sound, soft and far off, like hushed voices. The noise was almost too quiet to recognize, but it didn't sound like the usual rustling of leaves. It was clear now, whispering. The sound drifted from the forest, curling through the trees like it was trying to speak. It didn't feel like nature, it felt like something else, something alive, something aware. Arjun stood still for a moment, trying to convince himself it was just the wind, maybe the trees rubbing together. But the air felt too still for wind. He turned around and called to the others. Ria, Vikram, and Samir soon joined him, looking confused. "Did you hear that?" he asked. None of them had heard it at first. They shrugged it off, suggesting it was probably just some strange natural sound. Ria laughed and joked, "Maybe the forest spirits are gossiping about us." They all chuckled nervously, trying to brush off the odd feeling creeping into their minds. After all, it was just a whisper, right? But still, it didn't sit right with any of them. They decided to go on a hike to distract themselves, hoping that getting into the woods would clear the strange atmosphere hanging around the cabin. They wandered through the forest for a couple of hours, but the whispers didn't fade. Instead, they grew fainter and more distant, as if leading them deeper into the trees. The path twisted and turned, taking them deeper into the thick woods. The sun barely reached the ground now, and shadows grew long and dark. Samir suddenly stopped, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The others paused, a chill crawling up their spines. The whispers, they were back. Louder now, clearer, but still distant. It was as if the forest itself was calling them. They stood there for a long time, straining to hear, but nothing made sense. It sounded like a language, but not one any of them could understand. For a moment, they all exchanged nervous glances. Then, without warning, a sharp snap echoed from behind them. They turned quickly, expecting to see an animal or another hiker. But there was nothing. Only trees. Only shadows. They didn't wait any longer. The group quickly made their way back to the cabin, faster than they'd come, the whispers now seeming to follow them, lingering in the distance. Once back inside, a new tension settled over them. They tried to shake it off, but the weight of what they had heard, what they had felt, clung to them. It wasn't just the silence of the forest anymore. It was something more, something they couldn't explain. As the evening crept in, they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being watched, like the trees, the very air, was alive and aware of their every move. The next morning, the cabin felt different. A strange, unsettling atmosphere had settled over everything. It wasn't just the quiet or the whispers in the trees anymore. There was something about the place that felt off, as if the walls themselves were hiding something. The group moved slowly, unsure of how to shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. Arjun noticed it first. As they gathered in the living room for breakfast, he looked down the hallway and saw it. The door to the back room, which they hadn't touched since arriving, was now clearly locked. The door wasn't locked the night before. It had been left wide open when they first arrived, revealing a dusty room with old furniture and faded wallpaper. They hadn't thought much of it, but now the heavy old lock was turned. The brass, knob cold and stiff, as though someone had intentionally closed it. The others looked at the door, confused. "Did any of us lock that door?" Arjun asked, his voice sounding tense in the silence. Vikram shook his head. "I didn't. We all stayed in the living room last night, didn't we?" They all nodded, but something about the locked door made everyone uncomfortable. It was just an old room, right? But why would the door be locked now? Ria was the first to suggest that. Maybe the cabin owner had locked it before they arrived. Samir agreed, but a nagging feeling crept into his mind. "I swear I saw it open last night," he said, his voice low. "I noticed a crack in the door, like it was ajar for a second. There were toys inside. Dolls, I think." The others stared at him, trying to recall the moment he described. Arjun couldn't remember, but it seemed strange that a room that was supposed to be empty would have old toys in it. The air in the cabin had shifted, thick with unease, and now that feeling grew stronger. Without speaking another word, Vikram stood up, grabbed a chair, and smashed it against the door. The wood cracked, and the door fell open with a groan of protest. They all froze. Inside the room was nothing but darkness. The faintest smell of dampness filled the air, but what caught their attention was the sight of the dusty floor, where several old dolls were scattered. They were torn, their clothes tattered and faces cracked, staring up at them with blank, unblinking eyes. An old crib stood in the corner, its wooden bars warped and chipped. The sight of it sent a cold shiver down Arjun's spine. This room felt wrong, like it was never meant to be opened. As they stepped inside, they saw something else, Written in what looked like charred wood, across the wall in jagged letters, were the words, "Why did you leave me?" The message sent a wave of horror over them, the realization that something had happened here, something terrible, something they weren't supposed to understand. The door slammed shut behind them, sending everyone into a panic. They rushed outside, hearts pounding, not speaking as they hurried to gather their things. The forest outside, once silent, now seemed to press in closer, watching them leave. By the time they reached the porch, panic was beginning to set in. The horror of what they had just witnessed, the locked room, the dolls, the chilling message on the wall, clung to them like a shadow, refusing to let go. They could feel the weight of something watching them, pressing in from all sides. The forest had gone eerily quiet again, as if holding its breath, and the silence between them seemed to stretch longer than it should. They didn't talk at first. There was nothing to say, really. What could explain what had just happened? It didn't make sense. The idea that they'd been in the cabin for only 2 days seemed impossible now, as if everything had happened in a much longer stretch of time. Rhea was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "Now." There was no argument. No one wanted to stay in that cabin another second. But as they turned to gather their things, a soft sound cut through the air, an almost imperceptible whisper. The same voice they'd heard before, the one that had come from the forest, now seemed to surround them, like it was inside their heads, inside the cabin itself. The voice wasn't clear, but it felt like it was trying to say something urgent, something dark. It felt like the walls were closing in. They all froze, hearts racing, eyes wide. The whispering grew louder, sharper, the sound of 1,000 hushed voices weaving together, echoing off the cabin walls. They didn't move, not at first. The whispers weren't just in the air. They were in the very space around them, curling like smoke around their ears, filling the room with something they couldn't escape. And then it stopped, as quickly as it had started. But the air was thick now, impossibly heavy, like the weight of the whispers had left something behind. They packed quickly, trying not to look out into the forest, as if doing so would make the whispers return. But as they rushed to leave, another sound echoed from the trees, louder this time and unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though something was walking towards them, something with weight and purpose. They turned as one, eyes scanning the forest. But there was nothing. Nothing but the same old trees and shadows that seemed to stretch further than before. The footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming. The ground beneath their feet felt alive with something dark, something that had been waiting for them. As their hearts raced, their instincts screamed at them to run. They couldn't stay here anymore. Without a word, they rushed down the porch steps, hurrying toward their car. But when they reached it, something was wrong. The vehicle wasn't where they'd left it. The spot where they'd parked was empty. Panic surged through them as they scanned the area. Their car had vanished. There was no trace of it. Only the same endless forest stretching out before them, silent, as though mocking them for thinking they could escape. The whispers started again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from all sides. They were surrounded. Something was coming for them. The realization hit them all at once. There was no escape. Their car, the one thing that had promised to take them away from the nightmare, had vanished. No sign of it anywhere. The forest, once serene, now felt alive, its shadows deeper and more suffocating, as though the trees themselves were reaching out, closing in. The whispers swirled around them, growing louder with each passing second, and the footsteps in the distance had stopped. Instead, the forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching. They stood frozen in place, the panic rising in their chests as the quiet deepened. The oppressive stillness was suffocating, and then the air shifted. Something had changed. Something in the trees stirred, something unseen and enormous. They could feel it, the presence of something ancient, something far older than the cabin or the land beneath their feet. The trees groaned as if warning them to stay away. The ground trembled, a low hum vibrating through the earth. Ria's breath caught in her throat as she looked toward the woods, her gaze locking on something in the distance. There, just beyond the tree line, a shape was moving, a figure tall and shadowed, its outline barely visible in the gloom. It wasn't human. No, it was far too large. The figure seemed to drift in and out of the shadows, as though it could bend the very light around it. Every movement was fluid and unnatural, like something from a dream or a nightmare. Arjun, his heart hammering in his chest, dared to take a step forward, his eyes fixed on the shape. It was the size of a giant, towering over the trees, its form obscured by the forest itself. He felt the cold of its presence, a chilling aura that wrapped around him like a heavy cloak. His mind screamed at him to look away, to run, but his body didn't obey. Something held him there, rooted to the spot, just like the others. The figure didn't approach, but it didn't need to. The air around them thickened, as if the very space between them and the creature was closing, narrowing. The whispers returned, but this time, they weren't coming from all sides. They came from the figure itself, a soft, otherworldly hum that seemed to echo in their bones. The sound was hypnotic, pulling at their minds, making them feel dizzy, disoriented. Samir was the first to break from the trance, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to run! Now!" he shouted. But his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if the forest had swallowed it up. The others tried to move, but their legs felt like they were stuck in place, unable to take a step. The shape in the trees was watching them, its unseen eyes fixed on each of them, as though it could see into their very souls. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, looming over the forest, and the next, nothing. Just empty trees and silence. But the terror didn't fade. It had only grown stronger. The whispers grew frantic, desperate, like voices crying out for something. They turned back to the cabin, hoping for some refuge, but all they found was the same dark, empty space they'd left behind. The trees were closer now, closer than they should have been. Something was watching, and it wasn't done with them yet. The desperation that had settled over them was suffocating, thick and heavy like the forest itself was closing in. Every step they took felt slower, as if the ground beneath them was fighting back, refusing to let them leave. They were trapped, cornered by something they couldn't even fully comprehend. The creature, the shape in the trees, was still fresh in their minds, but it wasn't just the shadow that haunted them now. It was the deep, primal feeling of being hunted, the constant awareness that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. There was no longer any safe place. The cabin no longer seemed like a haven, but a prison, its walls closing in on them like the dark hands of some unseen force. Arjun could feel his heart thudding in his chest, the panic rising with each passing second. But no matter how fast they moved, it felt like the forest itself was moving with them, chasing them, creeping closer every time they looked back. They tried again to leave, moving away from the cabin, each of them hoping for some sign of salvation. But nothing came. The roads, once clear, were now blocked, as though nature itself had decided to trap them here. The trees had grown unnaturally tall, their branches twisting and reaching out, almost as if they were alive, stretching down into the path like claws, closing off any way out. The distant sound of something snapping, a branch breaking or a footstep, made them all freeze in place. There was no question now. The thing from the trees was coming. Rhea screamed, her voice breaking the silence like a cracked bell. But no one moved to comfort her. They couldn't. The fear that gripped them was too strong, too real. In that moment, they knew they were beyond help. They were on their own, with nothing but the weight of the forest and whatever haunted it pressing down on them. As the minutes dragged on, the sense of impending doom became unbearable. The air was thick with dread, and every step they took away from the cabin felt like they were being pulled back toward it. The whispers, once distant, now rang in their ears, louder and more urgent. There was no escaping the sound. It surrounded them, filling their minds with thoughts they didn't want, images they couldn't control. And then, without warning, the forest seemed to shift again. The sky darkened, turning an unnatural shade of purple, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. The shadows that stretched from the trunks of the trees began to twitch, moving of their own accord, as if the forest itself was coming alive. The whispers grew into words, though they were still too distorted to understand. They came faster, almost frantic, as if something was demanding to be heard. Each of them could feel it now, a presence pressing down on their very souls. It happened, in an instant. One moment they were standing there, paralyzed by fear, and the next, Rhea was gone. There was no scream, no warning. One moment she was beside them, and the next, she simply vanished, as though the forest had swallowed her whole. Panic surged through them as they spun in all directions, calling her name. But the only answer was the wind and the whispers. They hadn't stopped. They were louder now, swirling around them like a storm, growing more frantic, urging them to listen. But all they could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, as the forest closed in around them. There was no way out. There was no hope. And whatever it was that had taken Rhea, it wasn't finished. It had only just begun. The night seemed endless as the forest pressed in around them, suffocating them with its cold, oppressive darkness. They could feel the weight of it, the sinister energy that had taken hold of their minds. Rhea was gone, swallowed by the woods, in the blink of an eye, and no one had the strength to argue against the truth that was settling in their bones. They were not going to make it out. Panic clung to them like a second skin, but no matter how hard they tried to escape, the forest refused to let them go. Every direction they turned, every path they tried to take, led them back to where they started. The trees seemed to warp and twist, forming a labyrinth that was impossible to navigate, their roots rising up like hands trying to drag them into the earth. The whispers had stopped, but their absence only made the silence more oppressive. They felt as though the world around them had gone still, as if everything was waiting, holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and a strange, heavy fog had begun to roll in, swirling around their feet like it was alive. It moved with purpose, guiding them toward something they couldn't see but could feel pressing down on them. As they stumbled through the fog, desperate and disoriented, a low sound reached their ears. A distant, rhythmic thumping, like a heartbeat, deep and slow, as though the very forest itself was alive. It wasn't just the sound of the forest anymore. It was something far worse, something ancient. Their minds were clouded, but they couldn't ignore the feeling that they were being led somewhere. It was as though the forest had claimed them, its roots and branches now part of their fate. And then, in the distance, they saw it, an enormous tree, its trunk thick and gnarled, its roots winding deep into the earth. It stood out from the others, towering above the rest, its bark blackened and scorched as if it had survived something unspeakable. There was a hollow in the center of the trunk, large enough to swallow a person whole, and in the darkness, they could almost make out something inside it, something shifting, moving. A terrible realization began to dawn on them. The tree wasn't just a tree. It was a living thing, part of whatever had been haunting them. And in that hollow, they could hear it. The faint sound of something whispering, calling them by name as they approached. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the fog thickened, pulling them closer to the tree. It was then that they saw it, Rhea. Her body, lifeless and pale, was suspended in the hollow of the tree, her arms stretched out as if she were still reaching for something. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, her face frozen in terror. She was trapped, caught in the grip of whatever had been stalking them, and the forest had claimed her. It was too late. They had all been drawn here, lured by the whispers, the promise of escape, only to end up as part of the forest's twisted, dark heart. And as they stood there, staring at Rhea's lifeless form, they knew the truth. There would be no escape. The forest wasn't a place they had stumbled into by accident. It had been waiting for them. They were meant to be here. And now they were part of it. Forever.